and welcome to the Books on Asia podcast, sponsored by Stonebridge Press, publisher of fine books on Asia for over 30 years, located at www.stonebridge.com. And I'm your host, Amy Chavez. Today we have back on the show Alex Kerr, author of such notable books as Lost Japan, Dogs and Demons, Finding the Heart Sutra, and Another Kyoto. Today, Alex is going to talk about his latest book, Another Bangkok. This book is a follow-up to Another Kyoto, in which he introduces Thailand's capital city via its architecture, arts, and culture. The fascinating thing about this book is its connection to Japan's architecture, arts, and culture, and Alex explains this in more detail in this episode of the Books on Asia podcast. Just a note to our listeners, though, that in addition to the podcast episode, Alex has provided some visuals of the interior pages of the book for those interested, and these can be accessed on the Books on Asia YouTube channel. As always, relevant links to topics mentioned in the podcast, as well as links to the YouTube channel, can always be found in the podcast show notes, a copy of which can be found together with each episode on the website at booksonasia.net. So welcome back, Alex. And today you're going to tell us all about your new book, and I'm so excited.
Hi, Amy. I'm glad to be back on. And this time I'm going to be talking about a new book release, which is Another Bangkok. It comes out just a week from now on July 1st. And this is actually not a new book. It's a rewrite of a book that I put out, it's 13 years ago in 2009, which at that time was called Bangkok Found. So the idea back then was, Lost Japan, and then Bangkok Found. But in the meantime, I did Another Kyoto with Kathy Sokol back in 2016. And that book was sort of approaching Kyoto through some unusual angles. And I realized when I sat down to redo Bangkok Found that it was really closer to Another Kyoto. So it became Another Bangkok.
Okay, so your new book is Another Bangkok. Now, Is it anything like Another Kyoto? Are we going to get like gates and walls and floors and screens and explanations of all of this culture from Thailand?
We are, except not quite as arcane maybe as Another Kyoto, in that the subjects are broader. So there's a subject on living in an old house, a subject on living in a modern apartment, a subject in general on modern Thai design, a subject in general on a very important one, etiquette, Thai etiquette. We'll talk about that a bit later.
That sounds exciting.
It sounds like a silly kind of thing, but actually you've written a book on Japanese etiquette, so you know that it's not silly.
I can't wait to read the one on Thai etiquette.
No, because these things are critical to both Japan and Thailand, so that's a chapter that's actually a fairly important one. There's a chapter on food, things like that. They're fairly general, but what they share with Another Kyoto is that I'm going deep it begins by going deep into the traditional culture. And if I could read a few lines from my preface.
Oh, please.
So there I say, in Japan, bookshelves sag under the weight of books in English about ceramics, Ikebana, gardens, and the ways of thinking that have inspired them. People come to Japan on bended knee, eager to soak up the Zen wisdom of tea ceremony. You don't find this in Thailand, and it's because Thailand is mostly seen from abroad as a place for fun and relaxation, shopping and the beaches. Few would imagine the existence of a rich traditional culture from which you could learn something of value. So, Amy, that's really key. People dismiss Thailand. They don't understand that there is this rich culture.
And very much a part of their culture. And you do feel it when you go there. But because so many people are going just for the beach or for tourism, they might miss that.
And also, it's not written down or explained anywhere. I think, of course, people have written in depth on all these subjects, but I think I'm the first writer who sort of in a general way is looking at them all together and saying, okay, what is this traditional culture and how does it relate to the new Bangkok? So that's kind of the key to this book. Now, what I've done, by the way, the changes between this and Bangkok Found, I streamlined it a lot. Ever since my Heart Sutra book, I'm in a minimalist mode.
That's good.
Simple, shorter, sharper, more readable. So that was one thing. The other thing is, I brought it up today. We're more than a decade later, and an awful lot's happened in Thailand. Certain things, there's an increased modernization of the city. There's also been a lot of civil unrest. All these subjects that really had to be dealt with, and so they're in there.
I love the idea of rewriting something because we seldom get an opportunity to do that. And updating maybe a little bit, but to rewrite something. How did you feel about doing that? And what's the exciting part of rewriting?
First of all, it was a huge challenge, and it took me 3 years.
Wow.
It really wasn't easy. And for a long time, I didn't quite know where to go. And actually, again, the Heart Sutra showed me the way.
That's so great.
That's when I learned the joy of chopping and slicing and, throwing away your babies, so to speak. An awful lot of what I thought was clever and a fascinating little sideline wasn't needed after all.
Okay, and now is the page count the same, or is it a longer book or a shorter book?
It's a shorter book. With, however, one proviso, there are some additional illustrations. The book had been illustrated from the beginning using sort of photoshopped photos to make them look like line drawings, which actually that inspired later the drawings that are in Another Kyoto. But we've added a lot and formatted and so on the illustrations of the original book. So it's a little bit richer from an illustrative point of view.
And of course, I haven't seen this book yet, and you haven't either for that matter, the printed version. But I have seen the cover and admired it. And it seems to be a little bit of humor in there as well, because you have this Thai dancer, jumping out of this container. Can you explain the cover?
Yes, well, in a minute, I'm going to show a little PowerPoint, which has some of these images. So why don't I start with that now? We can talk about that as we go. And it begins with that cover. Okay, so now you see the cover? Yeah. So it draws on many of the themes in the book. There's actually a chapter in there about benjerong, which is a kind of Thai traditional ceramic. I once owned a benjerong shop in Bangkok.
Is that still in the book? Because I did, by the way, I have read Bangkok Found. So did you keep that in there?
Very much so.
Excellent.
I kept that in it, but of course that's updated as well because that talked about the street life, and there's been a lot of changes with the street life. But the chapter is there, and that's a benjerong bowl that dancer is stepping out of. So the people that designed it were at Penguin, and they just do such a charming and lovely job. And this captures a factor which appears a lot in this book, which is the Thai word sanuk. And sanuk means fun. It's key. In Japan, we can talk about wabi-sabi. In Thailand, you're not a tea master in your brown kimono. You're having fun. It's right. Sanuk. And this cover, I think, really captures that for sure. It's a lovely cover. I'm very happy with it. So first of all, this is the old Bangkok Found cover back in 2009. And on the right is the Another Kyoto cover. And so basically it's the content, revised content of Bangkok Found with the concept of Another Kyoto became this book. And it begins when I was a student back in the 70s, going to Thailand, and you may notice that it should have an S on it, pillars, right? Nobody ever talks about that. Which is the city pillar? Why are there two? That's where you start to realize that things in Thailand are not going to be so straightforward. And I then discussed that, and it had a lot to do with my arrival in Thailand, which was kind of based very much on city pillars, centered around the city pillar, which is, by the way, the official geographical center of Bangkok.
And you went out to find that, right?
No, I found it by accident.
Okay.
But became fascinated by it and kept going back to it. And each time I learned more. And I found that what I thought I knew the previous time was totally wrong. And that's part of this kind of overlay of multiple meanings and histories that you get so much in Thailand.
So is this kind of like the Nihonbashi Bridge of Thailand?
Yes, precisely. This is Nihonbashi. Yes. Luckily without a freeway on top of it.
Right. It looks like it's kind of close to the original even.
Well, very much so, yeah. Although, again, that's the question. What is the original? And a large part of this book has to do with that sometimes fruitless quest, but it's a very difficult quest in Thailand, much easier in Japan. And this is kind of the fascination of Thailand, is that it's harder to get at the roots of these things. So the city pillar is right next, of course, to the Grand Palace. And the Grand Palace is surely one of the most magical sights of this world. I took this photo during the kite flying season in March. It's just completely fantastical. And the Grand Palace is, I think, right up there with Red Square and Tiananmen, and actually more fabulous than either of them. But it's not seriously understood. What is this thing? What are we looking at? And so I talk about the different cultural influences from China, Java, India, Angkor Wat, the northern tribes along the Mekong, all the rest of it. It's all going into this. It's a treasure house of this stuff. Plus the fact that they intended it to be a fantasy. And part of what was going on, and this is generally true of Thai art, was elongation. So here you see in Angkor Wat, 11th century, these kind of artichoke-looking towers, right? Bulbous towers. Well, the Thai gets exactly the same framework of a central tower, four around it, and starts stretching it out. And so it becomes these tall, thin corn cobs. And everything gets stretched eventually. The eyes get elongated. The fingers get long and narrow. The temples, not only did the columns lean in, but notice how the base bows under. We call it the elephant's belly. And that's to make the whole thing even more kind of leaning inwards, elongation. And that was to make it more elegant, prettier, not a thing of this world, something dropped from heaven. That was the concept. So the Grand Palace is actually telling you something, that you're no longer in this world.
That's its secret, huh?
That's the secret. People know me for doing old houses in Japan, but I've also done old houses in Thailand. And for a long time, I rented a house in Bangkok in an area called Lat Phrao, and this was it. So there's a chapter on living in an old house.
That looks amazing.
Oh, it was completely magic. And we would go and sit on that veranda and dancers would dance for us. It was something out of this world. I don't rent it anymore, but it was a big part of my life for 15 years. And so I described that experience. So talk about living in a new apartment house, my condo that I rent in the heart of the city, right near Asok, which is the biggest intersection. And there's the BTS, that's the SkyTrain entrance, and the motorcycle boys who are at the top of these, what they call sois, which are these smaller streets, because the mass transit buses and so on can't get into them. So you find a motorcycle and you sit on the back and he takes you into the soi.
Right, like a taxi.
Yeah, of course, we have taxis and tuk-tuks and so on, but the motorcycle boys are very much a unique Bangkok thing with their numbered jackets. They're all registered and numbered. Street life, key to Thailand, one of its most attractive features, also somewhat endangered. And I talk a lot about the changes because the government of Bangkok now sees street vendors as old-fashioned and messy. We want to get rid of it, although this is actually one of the most appealing aspects of the city. It's still strong, it's still there, but there are big sections where they've been swept away. Now we get to etiquette. This is the Amy subject. So one of the things about Thailand is because it's so Sanook and fun, and the Thai smile is so charming and people go to Thailand and they're swept away by that. Oh, the sweet Thais. What they don't realize Marayat, they call it, which is the Thai etiquette, is incredibly hierarchical and complex, right up there with Japanese keigo, the polite language of Japan, and where you sit in a room, and when you bow and who bows first and all that. There are 4 kinds of why. That's this nice gesture that foreigners coming for the first time think is oh so sweet and relaxed and charming. But actually, the person that's making that gesture has done a very complex algebra, figuring out who's higher and lower and who's closer and farther and so on. And there are many, many other aspects of this marayat. But part of it is ultimately about creating a mood of gentleness. Gentleness is key. And I get corrected by my staff if I close a door too loudly, or they say you're stomping across the floor, people raising their voice, people showing anger, anything to ruffle that smooth surface is not acceptable.
Now, in what way is that different from Japan? Because I think of Japan as that way too, but a little bit more forgiving here.
That's where I had kind of an epiphany, which is, why did I end up in Thailand and, for example, not in China? And it's because they both have this. They're closely related. And Japanese come to Thailand and just fit right in. They're very familiar with all of this, plus aspects of reserve, thinking twice before you say something, how that's going to impact somebody. Enryo in Japanese, which is exactly what they call rengjai in Thailand. And even seiza, the Japanese way of sitting, and nanpomkip, all of which, by the way, are discussed in the book. So I compare it with Japan because they are close. Where Japan is different, I think, are 2 things. One, there is that kind of military leftover of, hey,
right.
And you walk into a restaurant and someone says, "Irashaimase,"
Yeah. There is a boldness and almost a stiffness as well, yes.
Yeah. And in Thailand, it's all about seamless curves. It's almost imperceptible. It's so gentle and elegant. And for example, for children, by the way, the marayat is taught in schools. And they have marayat contests like we have spelling bees.
That's wonderful.
And it's not just about how correctly you can do it, but how beautifully you do it. That's part of what's going on here. And that's part of the secret. This is why Bangkok wields its never-ending charm for travelers from around the world. And it goes back to this. So this is actually key. And I think for a lot of people, even who visited in Thailand a lot, this may be a bit of an insight into what's behind all that nice smile and so on.
Exactly. And could you just go through briefly the 4 kinds of why that we're looking at right now?
From right to left, it's from high to low. Let's start with this one here on the left is a normal one to a friend or an equal, right?
Okay.
The one here it's more senior person. The third one is to a monk, and the last one would be to a king or a royal.
Okay, so the head's quite bowed over there, and the hands are higher up almost at the hairline.
That's right. The placement of the thumb and fingers changes. And that's just for the why, but there's also the way to give something or receive something, how you walk, how you sit, many, many other aspects of this thing.
Okay, sign me up for classes.
Well, you need to come to Bangkok and write your
yeah, Bangkok, Thailand etiquette.
Thailand etiquette. So a lot of this has to do with one's placement in the world. We have this marvelous drawing of the so-called 3 worlds, which it's a little too complicated to go into now, but that's another aspect that's kind of key to Thai thinking, that everything comes in levels and that you should find your level and behave properly within it.
Is this a bit like a mandala?
Yes, this is. And in fact, I think this is Professor Vitti, my good friend, actually drew this. And I think it's the best drawing of the 3 worlds that I've ever seen. And this is exactly what's going on in a Japanese pagoda. This concept is all across Asia, but the Thais really developed it. So then we get to the kind of the look of Thai things, right? These chofa finials, you take one look and you know this is Thai, right?
Right.
And it's because of something called Lai Thai. There is, with Japanese calligraphy, there are techniques and ways to, you have to study it, and you don't just sit down with your brush and splash something. You need to know how to do it. The same thing goes with Lai Tai. There's actually a very ancient tradition with the lines and dry styles that go all the way back to Angkor Wat, or even earlier, back to Java and India. And this shows you how to draw this kind of flame-like, flare-like pattern, which is very typical of Lai Tai, and which tells you instantly, this is Thailand.
Wow, it's like, yes, anyone could trace that and make them themselves then, couldn't they?
Yeah, and this is actually the roof finials of a totally outrageous fantasy Wat in northern Thailand, Wat Rongkun, by one of the leading contemporary artists, Chalerm Chai. And here's kind of super contemporary. Lai Tai has become kind of cosmic, right? Digital, 0 and 1, using these Lai Tai patterns to express something very modern. Then we talk about, there's a chapter on food and the incredible changes that have taken place in food, and it develops into costume. And here's where some of the difference with Japan comes. Japan in food is about finding the shun, the food of the moment, of the season, and separating it out from everything else, so all the tastes are very distinct and raw and simple in and of themselves, and so on. Thailand is absolutely the opposite. It's mix and mingle. They'll hang fish to make them look like flowers. Nothing ends up the way it starts out. It's a constant fusion. They really invented fusion before we had it in modern times, and that's why Thai food is so fantastic. Is the fusion, and I talk a lot about that. But also, this happened in clothing. So you can see that they took jongkabane as these kind of lower folded trousers that princess is wearing on the left, with Victorian button sleeves. That's what happened in the 19th century. I made a mistake. I said 1820s. It's 1920s. They got into this kind of Gatsby look. She's wearing high heels and a kind of Gatsby shirt, but she's wearing the classic Thai passing dress.
Mm-hmm.
So they mixed and mingled, and that goes on today. And so Queen Sirikit had French designers use Thai fabric to do modern dresses.
I see. Wow.
Sadly, it never happened in Japan. So Japan benefits and loses as well. It benefits because the kimono that we see today is the real thing, right? It didn't get all changed and complicated, and strange foreign influence was mostly not brought in. On the other hand, kimono are dying because they were never updated. No one ever really attempted to make a really chic Paris designer kind of modern dress using Japanese materials and so on.
And also a kind of kimono that women could work in, because before they were just sitting around looking beautiful. And then once they started working, of course, the kimono became less usable.
Precisely. But the Thais have a 150-year head start on this.
Yeah.
And they've been working on it with their sort of fusion approach, right? So that's in the food chapter, oddly enough, because we start out with food and then it leads into all these other fusions.
Wonderful.
There's another chapter on baisi, which is the Thai Ikebana, right? It's Thai flowers. And everybody knows about bonsai, and they know about Ikebana and those things. Nobody knows that Thailand has this incredibly elaborate, fantastic flower arranging tradition, which again, nothing ends up looking out like what it started with. It's not like you take the flower and you put it in the vase. No, you take the pieces, the leaves, and fold them up and create these kind of origami-like structures.
Now, to me, these look like offerings.
They are offerings.
Wow, beautiful.
That's what they began as. And this, the one on the right here is one you might see in a village.
Mm-hmm.
But the one on the left is an incredibly grand one that's taller than me at a royal temple. And the one on the right is a modern one. So again, they've been modernizing it. Sakun, Thailand's leading modern flower person, designer, he's actually an engineer by background, and he's picked up on the kind of the engineering-like construction of these things to do these very modern forms. So baisi is something that you could, when you do come to Thailand, you'll see it everywhere. Most people just don't question. They don't know what this is. Dance. Of course, me with my kabuki background and all that, I'm a dance obsessive, and I've become very involved with Thai dance. And there's a chapter in there about that. The two classic hand gestures, Jeep and Wong, right? Jeep, which becomes Wong, which you'll see in any Thai dance that you ever witness. And there's a discussion of that and where those gestures came from. And again, practically every chapter, really the structure of this book has to do with, let's look at the traditional culture and now let's see how it's showing itself today. And so we have the contemporary dancers, Pichet in Bangkok, Ronarong in Chiang Mai, doing a completely modern take. I talk about my art collection, which began by collecting prehistoric pots, 2,000 or 3,000 year old historic pots, which you could easily buy in the market in those days. And I won't give away the whole story, but I will say that there's some unexpected twist. It's not just about, oh, what fun it was to collect these things. I'll leave it at that. It's not provoking. It's something we never think about. These difficult issues of art collecting, such as should you even really be collecting them, do not rise so much in Japan, but are a factor in the world and certainly in Southeast Asia. And then that leads me into the same kind of patterns that are on the benjerong jar and on the prehistoric pots, but are on this contemporary time. I love these modern Thai, they call it pineapple eye pattern. That's where we end up in that chapter. And of course, foreigners, expats. You know, I've lived for Japan and so long, I didn't think of myself as an expat.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, expats were bankers in Tokyo, right? Not us. But when I got to Thailand, where I didn't speak Thai, I wasn't familiar with the culture, my good friends were the foreigners, still are, many of them. I now have some good Thai friends, but the foreigners are very much a part of it. And of course, Thailand's, unlike Japan, been very open and welcoming to foreigners for a very long time, including the story of Phokon, who was a Greek adventurer who became one of the high ministers in the court of King Narai in the 17th century. And the right-hand side, we have the Oxbridge dinner, Oxford-Cambridge dinner. And the thing about this is, if you went to the Oxbridge or Yale dinner or Harvard dinner or something in Tokyo, you'd meet some kind of medium-level professors. When you do this in Thailand, you meet prime ministers. I've been at these things where there were three prime ministers who had gone to Oxford and Cambridge, bank presidents, etc. They're the people that run the country, and they've been going to Oxford and Cambridge, again, for 150 years, since the 19th century. And so there's this long tradition of Thai involvement with the West, as well as Westerners deeply involved in Thailand. And so that is the background of which, of course, I'm one in a long stream of foreigners that are drawn to the country. And of course, there's also Thailand it's, as I say in the book, it's like another La Dolce Vita land, namely Italy, which has been overrun and is to this day with foreigners, and yet keeps very much to its own. So Italy is fabulous, but it's actually rather difficult to penetrate if you're a foreigner living there. And Thailand is the same way. So it's not so easy, actually. And in some ways, Japan is surprisingly easier. And then finally, I talk about the many different religions. Thailand's supposedly a Buddhist country, but what are we doing with all these Hindu statues of Brahma and Vishnu, so on, that you see everywhere? And so there's a discussion of what that means, and the animism and all the other overlays of religion. And finally, of course, sort of folk religion or animism, such as Nangkwak, the good luck beckoning lady. And of course, we who live in Japan originally immediately realized that this must have come from the Maneki Neko, right?
Yeah, right.
I think it did.
It even looks a little bit like Maneki Neko.
Completely, because, you know, this gesture is, to my knowledge, uniquely Japanese. And so that got into Maneki Neko, and somehow at some point Maneki Neko got into Thailand, and then you get that fusion. So the Maneki Neko fused with a heavenly maiden.
I like it. That's wonderful.
And on the left is a very traditional one. On the right hand, I love that kind of pudgy one who was in a hamburger shop.
Well, I am absolutely salivating now. I can't wait to read this book.
Well, I think for anyone that is thinking of traveling to Thailand, I think this could be really helpful, because you'll know what you're looking at.
Right. It's like a cultural guidebook then.
Yeah, exactly.
I will write up some show notes for people, and they can go and look at those and get all of the links and the different things we've been talking about. And also, you want to give us a little bit on your new YouTube channel?
Yes. So my new channel. This is COVID, a COVID phenomenon, with all of my work canceled and no guests coming, and sitting here in Kameoka. I've had an awful lot of leisure, and I've become something of a gardener. I pull the weeds, and I fix the tendrils of the morning glories in the morning, and I go out at night and listen to the frogs and watch the fireflies, and it's all very nice. But I started thinking, really, I should do a little more than that. So, so one of the things that's been on my mind for years is this. In the old days, such as with David Kidd, or with Shirasu Masako, that great kind of dean of Japanese art back in the 90s. The way, or Professor Vitti down there in Bangkok, the way that they talk about things was they would take something, just one object often, and pull the secret out of it. And it was done with a lot of fun and laughing as we went along, and a lot of give and take. And those conversations I really miss. And I haven't had them for a long time. And I thought, okay, let's give up on it being a conversation. Why don't I just talk? And
and you can teach us.
Yeah, well, it's hopefully it's a give and take, although an invisible one, between listeners who are interested in these things.
They're short, like under 10 minutes each, right? And you take one object and you explain it and you bring out the secrets about it. And after watching just one, then the person knows what to look for and how to recognize the object in its different manifestations and knowing what it's used for. And it's a very effective way.
Well, I call it the secrets of things. And it's because I'm not being an academic, and I'm not giving you dates and names and provenances and that kind of thing. So it's more about what's essential about this, what's interesting and fun about it. Let's look. And very often, I don't think I can do it always, but certainly in the ones that I've done so far, there's a bit of activity where I physically show something like how to paper an andon, which is not something you'd see every day. So,
and by the way, that andon, I have read about andon so often in Japanese literature, but I had never seen one. That was great. I could finally get to see an andon.
Well, you don't see them in daily life, that's for sure. So each time I'm going to take up different subjects. So far we did a ceramic, a Chinese Rui scepter, the andon floor lamps. I won't say what's coming next, but it'll be completely different. But the kind of subjects will have paintings, screens, scrolls, ceramics, bronze, bamboo, paper, all kinds of media, all kinds of objects, large and small. And some of them will be precious, valuable, museum pieces, and others will be, a very standard working knife or brush. And then what is this? So it will range pretty widely.
That sounds wonderful. Well, thank you very much for coming on the show again and talking to me, and for all of our listeners out there. Once again, check the show notes, and I will put in all the links, and including the Secrets of Things, Alex Kerr's new YouTube channel and his new book, Another Bangkok.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you.
You've been listening to the Books on Asia podcast, produced and edited by Michael Palmer. Logo by Alex Kerr. Sponsored by Stonebridge Press, publisher of fine books on Asia for over 30 years. They can be found at www.stonebridge.com. For more interviews, book reviews, and other features, visit the Books on Asia website at booksonasia.net.